Good afternoon. My name is Sandy Latecki, and I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Jackson County. And I'd like to introduce Cindy Buys, a SIU Law Professor, and she will be talking today about contemporary issues in the international law. And she'll include issues such as the war in Ukraine, human rights violations in Afghanistan and Iran, excuse me, and the resulting refugee crisis. Cindy is a professor at SIU School of Law, and she's taught there since 2001. Cindy, welcome.
Thank you so much for that welcome. I'm going to share my screen with everyone, and we can begin. There we go. And I will say I prepared some PowerPoint slides, but I'm very happy to have a conversation about what interests the folks who are attending. And so I'll get us started with some things that you might be hearing about in the news. But if you have questions, I think that you are certainly invited to ask those questions. And I hope that we can talk about, other issues that might be of interest to you. So the thing that I think is on most people's minds these days is the war in Ukraine. So I thought we might start with that. See if I can get my PowerPoint to move here. I was just going to start by talking a little bit about the how it all started. And you may know that the war in Ukraine started because Russia had contested some of the eastern areas of Ukraine in the Crimea. And it actually was back in 2014 that Russia first invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. And there are some other disputed areas in what they call the Donbass region. So we often talk about the war in Ukraine starting in February 2022, but most people in the region actually date the wars beginning back to 2014. But it was in the third week of February, I think it was the 26th of February 2022, that Russia launched its upgraded or more aggressive invasion of Ukraine, which of course is still ongoing. Given that I'm an international lawyer, I thought that I would frame this in terms of some of the violations of international law that we are seeing Russia commit in the area. So first, under international law, there are rules about when states can and cannot use force. And these rules are spelled out in the United Nations Charter. In particular, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter states that other states must respect the sovereign integrity and territory and political independence of states. And clearly, Russia has violated that with its use of force against Ukraine, its incursions into Ukrainian territory. Under the UN Charter, there are reasons why the use of force can be justified, primarily in self-defense. And, Russia has argued that Ukraine was not allowing people to pursue their desire to be more Russian in terms of their culture or to pursue their desire to be part of Russia. But even if Russia were right about that, it doesn't justify the use of force. To use force under the UN Charter, you have to be the victim of an armed attack. And you're supposed to then report that armed attack to the UN Security Council and request for assistance from the Council. And of course, Ukraine had not attacked Russia, and Russia had not gone to the UN Security Council, declaring itself a victim of an attack and involving the UN Security Council. So for all these reasons, Russia's invasion into Ukraine is a clear violation of international law. There are also old rules about the use of force in international law that still are present today. And we talk about the principles of necessity and proportionality. And what that means is that if you are going to use force, even if you're using it in self-defense, You should only use the amount of force that is necessary at the time when it is necessary. In other words, to repel an attack. And when you are choosing what weapons or how to respond to that attack, you should not use any more force than is necessary. And of course, the idea here is that we want to limit loss of life. And so whatever weapons you choose to use should be proportional to the threat that you face. Russia has repeatedly attacked civilian targets. It has attacked medical facilities, trains, roadways that civilians are using to evacuate Ukraine, shopping centers, schools, many, many places that there are civilians. And under international law on the use of force, states are not supposed to use weapons that cannot distinguish between military targets and civilian targets. So if Russia is using weapons indiscriminately in this way, and it's not able to target military installations, and instead, these bombs and missiles are hitting civilian areas, whether intentional or whether reckless, it's still a violation of international law. There is also evidence, and we've already had the first trial, with respect to Russian service members who have committed war crimes against Ukrainian civilians, as well as POWs. There is evidence that there has been torture of individuals. There is quite a bit of evidence that Russian troops have raped women as part of their war efforts and committed other sexual assaults. So in addition to the unlawful killing, we have a number of other war crimes committed by individual members of the Russian military. Finally, there's also quite a bit of concern that Russia has forcibly transferred many people, particularly from the eastern regions where Russia has been occupying some areas. And, estimates are that more than 1 million people have been transferred from Ukraine to Russia, largely against their will. And that includes 180,000 children. There have also been some reports that Russia has been making attempts to amend its laws on adoption so that Russian families can raise these Ukrainian children who are being forcibly taken from their families as Russians, to try to increase its population and build support for Russian goals and Russian nationalism, and to reduce the population of Ukraine. So again, I'm going to pause periodically, and if you have questions, you're certainly welcome to ask those questions. So this is a pretty dire picture of what is happening in Ukraine, and I'm sure that you see many of these things on the news. What I'd like to focus on is what can international law do about it, or what is happening in response to these violations of international law. So one of the first things that we think about are crimes that are committed, crimes against humanity, war crimes. And although neither Russia nor Ukraine are parties to the International Criminal Court, Ukraine made a referral to the International Criminal Court asking the ICC to investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide that may be committed on its territory. And an individual state can do that even if it's not a party to the ICC statute. And so the International Criminal Court has opened an investigation, and there are people on the ground in Ukraine who are documenting these activities of Russian soldiers and the military more generally, and the leaders in Ukraine. Now, this is really in many ways unprecedented. When there was the genocide in Rwanda in the early 90s, as well as the ethnic conflict in the former Yugoslavia, also in the early 90s, the ICC didn't exist yet. And so to be trying to gather evidence in such a widespread armed conflict simultaneously as the crimes are being committed is really something new. And it's going to take some time for all of that evidence to be gathered, for witnesses to be identified, for the court to actually begin any kind of proceedings. And then, of course, it has to obtain jurisdiction over the persons who are committing the crimes. And if they're Russian soldiers back on Russian soil, very unlikely that Russia is going to allow them to be tried before the International Criminal Court. So there are investigations ongoing, but when and if cases can be brought against Russia is still unknown at this point. Separately, there is also a case that was brought by Ukraine against Russia at the International Court of Justice. And this is a separate court from the International Criminal Court. The International Court of Justice, and I have a picture of the Peace Palace on the lower right side of your screen, it sits in The Hague, as does the International Criminal Court, but the ICJ is part of the United Nations system. The International Criminal Court is not. It is an independent court that was created by an international treaty called the Rome Statute. So the International Criminal Court does have jurisdiction over both Ukraine and Russia because they are both parties to the Genocide Convention. And that convention gives the ICJ jurisdiction to decide disputes that arise under the convention. Ukraine is alleging that Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine. And the definition of genocide in that convention is that there is an attempt to really wipe out in whole or in part a group of people. And the argument here is that the actions of Russia, at least in the parts of Ukraine where it is occupying the territory, are sufficient to rise to the level of genocide. I mentioned a moment ago that they are forcibly transferring over 1 million people, that they're trying to place Ukrainian children in families in Russia to Russify them. They are killing many, many civilians in addition to military targets. And all of this, Ukraine alleges, amounts to genocide. Now, genocide is a very difficult crime to prove. Ukraine will have to prove that the leaders are intentionally engaging in these activities because they want to exterminate a particular group in whole or in part. And that intent in criminal law can be a very difficult burden. And you have to show exactly who intended. Is it just President Putin? Is it military leaders? Is it other soldiers? Those are all questions that the International Court of Justice may have to deal with eventually as this case goes forward. I mentioned earlier that we've already seen our first trial and conviction of a Russian soldier for war crimes, and that trial happened in a Ukrainian court. The Ukrainian courts are still open and functioning in many parts of the country, and they have begun having some national trials of Russian soldiers who've been captured and where there is evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity. There are questions about whether this is the best way to handle it. You can imagine that, most Russian soldiers probably feel that they would not receive a fair trial in Ukraine. It would be hard to have an unbiased trial when you're in the midst of a war. But it is the way that many war crimes have been handled historically before we had an international criminal court. In the United States, you may have heard of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or UCMJ. And the United States has this UCMJ pursuant to which it can and does prosecute both US soldiers when they misbehave and foreign soldiers when we are involved in armed conflict and those foreign soldiers violate the laws of war. And that UCMJ implements the Geneva Conventions on the laws of war, which we are a party to, and virtually every country of the world, including Ukraine and Russia, are a party to. There are other efforts outside of legal matters. There are, of course, many different types of sanctions that are being leveled on individual Russian persons, on Russian companies, on the Russian government and military. So I've indicated some here. There are bans on certain products from Russia. Russia has been excluded from the international financial system, SWIFT. So if any of you have ever traveled abroad and you've needed to transfer money, you might be familiar with SWIFT. There are bans on Russian flights. There used to be some visas called golden visas that Russians could purchase to go to Europe, and those are being shut down. So there are lots of ways that the international community is trying to put pressure on Russia and prevent it from being able to obtain money and weapons and other things that it needs to fuel its war effort. And of course, the United States and Europe primarily have been providing weapons and training to Ukrainian soldiers. And this is one of the reasons that Ukraine has been able to be as successful as it's been in pushing back Russia so far. Certainly, they have shown tremendous will and fortitude and resilience, but they've also been supplied with money and weapons and training from the West, which has fortified their ability to fight this war. So that's where we are right now. As I said, I think one of the things that it's important to remember is that international law and justice often moves very slowly. And so in the long run, I do expect that many Russians will be held accountable for the things that are being done right now in Ukraine. But I don't expect that that's going to happen in the next few weeks or even months. I think this is going to be a long-term process for the international community to come to grips with everything that's happening in Ukraine and to bring some justice to the victims of the war. All right, so moving on to another topic that has been in the news in the United States quite a bit is what is happening in Afghanistan. And so again, just as a reminder, you'll recall that the United States announced that it was going to withdraw all US troops from Afghanistan by September 11th, 2021. The United States had been in Afghanistan for 20 years since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, 2001, when we initially went in to seek Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda and eliminate their ability to attack the United States again. It was sometimes referred to as a forever war. During the Trump administration, there were negotiations with the Taliban as well as with the Afghan government at the time. And there was an agreement signed that we would be withdrawing our troops, and the Biden administration continued in that effort to draw down US troops in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the Afghan government was not able to stand on its own, and in fact, it collapsed much more quickly than I think anyone in the United States anticipated. And so by mid-August, about a month before the US troops were to be withdrawn, the Taliban entered Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. It took over the capital, it took over the presidential palace, and really became the ruling party in Afghanistan. And from that time until the 30th of August, the United States completed its troop withdrawal really ahead of schedule because the Taliban had moved so quickly in consolidating its control over the country. We were still at the airport. I'm sure you all saw the scenes on the news where we were trying to evacuate people as quickly as possible before more lives were lost. And in addition to the US military personnel who were evacuated, the US military and nonprofit organizations working in Afghanistan evacuated about 76,000 Afghans to the United States. And I'm sure many of you know that we have 4 of those Afghan families who were evacuated here in Carbondale right now, who are being sponsored by various groups here in Carbondale. So what has happened in Afghanistan since the Taliban have taken control again? And I think one of the things that has been most disappointing is the fact that there has really been little accountability for what is going on with the Taliban. When the Taliban took power, they initially promised that they would allow girls and women to attend school, but they quickly reneged on that promise. And so they are allowing girls to attend school up until 6th grade only, but they have closed down all secondary schools. And so all of the young ladies who became school age since September 2001, 20 years ago, they've never known life under the Taliban, and they were allowed to attend school. They were allowed to attend university. They were allowed to have jobs, and all of this is now gone. The Taliban have issued new decrees that women must once again cover their faces as well as the rest of their bodies when in public. They have largely barred women from working outside of the home. There are many, many careers that are completely off limits to women. There are some areas where some women are still allowed to work outside the home, but it's pretty limited. Women have been told to remain home, except in cases of necessity. And they've been told that they should have a male relative accompany them when they're out in public, particularly if they're going outside of their neighborhood, like beyond just the local market or that sort of thing. And so women's rights have really been set back quite significantly in Afghanistan, despite the Taliban's promises that it would not be like it was, 25, 30 years ago. The Taliban also abolished a government agency called the Ministry of Women's Affairs. All the women who were serving in government lost their positions, and women have been completely excluded now from political life in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, when it was under a democratically elected government, had joined the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It has not withdrawn from that convention, but it is basically ignoring international law. And there really has been very little accountability. The international community, I think, has been largely focused on the war in Ukraine and other matters, and has not taken steps to do much about what's happening with respect to women who are increasingly becoming prisoners in their homes once again, being told who to marry, when to marry, being barred from education, being barred from work. Oops. So I'll just pause there just in case there are any questions before we go on.
Barb McCassin had her hand up before. Barb, did you have a question for us, for Cindy?
Barb, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question.
Okay. Well, it was about Ukraine. I wondered if Cindy had heard the proposal from Jeffrey Sachs. I heard him talking about it on Democracy Now! Yesterday. And, he has a proposal to stop the war. And, since it's destroying Ukraine and virtual genocide, and have Turkey mediate and have the Donbass be like an autonomous region, let Russia keep the Crimea. Of course, it would all be negotiable, but seems like he was saying, almost like the US and Britain should negotiate something. And, while, everybody now is just saying, well, the Ukrainians have to decide, things are pretty extreme. Should we step in, or what do you think?
So I was not particularly familiar with that proposal, but I've heard many similar proposals. And I guess I come from that starting point that this really has to be Ukraine's decision. It's their territory, their people that are suffering the most. I think the United States should support them for sure. But I don't think that we are in a place where what were the world powers, the colonial powers really, should be the ones that are telling other states what to do. And so I think it's a very sensitive way that we can potentially support and encourage negotiations, but making sure that the Ukrainians are the ones who are the decision makers. Certainly the loss of life is terrible. I pray every day that there is going to be some way that they can find peace. for Ukraine to just give up Crimea basically means that Russia is rewarded for its aggressive use of force. And, maybe you have to allow for some concessions in order to get Russia to stop. But I do think it sets a bad precedent that, or not precedent, but it continues perhaps, a history where those with military force can invade and take by force land and resources and people that, don't want to be part of that country. And so I think we have to be really careful that we're not saying that what Russia did is acceptable and that it should be allowed to be repeated by other countries. Certainly other countries like China are watching this very closely to see, if Russia can do this, well, maybe we can get away with it too, right? So I think there's lots of geopolitical issues that are involved there as well.
Yeah, so one of Jeffrey Sachs' points is that 75% of the world's countries are not participating in boycotting or sanctioning Russia. So he's saying he doesn't think that's really going to work.
He's saying that he doesn't think the sanctions are going to work. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Yeah. And it is true that many of the countries have remained on the sidelines. And I have to say, as an international lawyer, I find that incredibly disappointing because it is so clear that Russia is violating international law. But I also understand that many of them are poorer countries who are dependent on certain supply lines, who don't want to antagonize a superpower type country like Russia, who could, and have serious sanctions, or not sanctions, but consequences that they may suffer as a result of speaking out too much one way or the other. And then there are other superpowers, like I said, like China, and they're not alone by any means, who are also thinking, well, let's see how this plays out. And, if it's not so bad for Russia in the end, then, maybe we can try this too. So there's lots of complicated politics there. And I agree, the sanctions are not perfect. They're certainly hurting Russia, but Iran is, I think, the most obvious example of a country that is supplying drones and weapons and other things to Russia and refusing to abide by the international community's sanctions on Russia. And so that also raises additional issues. And we haven't even really talked about the threat of nuclear war either. And of course, Russia has threatened that it could use nuclear weapons. Thankfully, its sanity has prevailed so far, and no nuclear weapons have been used. But it's a threat that is not idle. And I think it's also a consideration as we are trying to sort through how we resolve this kind of a conflict as an international community. So speaking of Iran, that was where I was actually going to go next. I suspect that you have all heard about Mahsa Amini, who is a young woman from Kurdistan in the north of Iran, who was arrested allegedly for violating Iran's strict rules for wearing the hijab, or the headscarf, and she died while in custody. The official position of the Iranian government was that she had a heart attack. No one seems to believe that, and there's some evidence that she was beaten and tortured while in custody, and that was actually what caused her death. Her death sparked protests. There was already a lot of tension in Iran over a variety of things. There have been economic problems in Iran for a while. There have been water shortages in recent months. Of course, women's rights have been an issue there, as well as in Afghanistan, but also really brutal crackdowns by the government, limiting freedom of expression, speech, and internet access. And people have been feeling very frustrated with the fact that the economic situation is bad. And when they speak out about it, they are really beaten and killed. It's very hard to get a true estimate of the death toll in Iran right now because foreign journalists are not being allowed to be present and to be reporting in the country. But there are some estimates that about between 450 and 550 people have died now at the hands of the government since these protests began, and another 16,000 persons have been injured. So it's a real serious situation. It's a large protest. It's somewhat surprising that the protests are continuing in this way. And it's perhaps encouraging for the young people who are really leading it. Before I go on to my next slide, I'll stop and see if I can answer a couple of these questions that I can now see in the Q&A. So the first question has to do with whether we have an embassy or an ambassador in Afghanistan, Russia, and Iran. I can tell you that we do not in Afghanistan. We have shut down all of our consulates in Afghanistan, which is one of the reasons why Afghans who are still trying to flee are having such a hard time, because there's no active US consulate or embassy where they can go and get their visa and get out to the United States. So for Afghans right now, they have to go to a third country. Many of them are going to Pakistan and going to a US embassy or consulate in Pakistan in an attempt to get to the United States. I don't believe we've recalled our ambassador from Russia, but I did not look that up, so I can't answer that for sure. We have not had good diplomatic relations with Iran for many, many years. We rely on third countries like Switzerland to negotiate for us or be an intermediary with respect to Iran. So we do not have an ambassador there, to my knowledge. There's a comment here that those who understand Russian history say that Crimea has already been part of Russia until the fall of the Soviet Union. And it is true that there are disputed claims to that region. But, the boundaries have changed over history. And in international law, we have a principle called self-determination. And what that means is that people should be allowed to choose for themselves how they want to be governed economically, politically, culturally, etc. And so if both Ukraine and Russia were to respect the right to self-determination, what they would really do is have a free and fair referendum in which the people could vote. Do they want to be part of Russia? Do they want to be part of Ukraine? Do they want to be autonomous? And have that be run by a neutral entity, not by the Russian government, as was done in some of those disputed regions, so that you can be sure that the people are not feeling coerced and that they're able to really express their desires in terms of their future governance. So ideally, that's what would happen with those disputed regions. I'm not familiar enough with the Crimean government to know about when exactly any changes occurred. All right, so going back to Iran, there has been more of an international response to what has happened in Iran than there has been in Afghanistan. And maybe part of that comes from the fact that Iran has been somewhat of a pariah in the international system for some time. And so this is not a new situation in many ways. It's a continuation. You may recall that during the Obama administration, there was a negotiated agreement with Iran that was an attempt to limit Iran's development of nuclear weapons. That agreement was something that the Trump administration was very much opposed to, and they terminated. The Biden administration has been trying to renegotiate that. There were some aspects of it that people criticized quite strongly, and there were other aspects that perhaps were good and beneficial and were working. But no new agreement has been reached. And so again, the focus has been on Iran for a while. And so I think that's partly why we're seeing a little bit more of an international response to Iran. I'm having trouble advancing my slide at the moment, but I will tell you that one of the responses has been to focus specifically on what's happening with women's rights in the last couple of months. Iran, about 4 months ago, was elected to before the Mahsa Amini situation, was elected to the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations. And the elections are secret. They are run in a way that allowed Iran to become a member of that governing body. And there are many people that were very unhappy with that at the time and have become much more unhappy since the protests in Iran and what's been happening with women and the headscarves in Iran. And so there have been calls to remove Iran from the CSW because the CSW, the Commission on Status of Women, really sets the agenda for women's issues at the UN. And most people argue that Iran should not be allowed to be part of that conversation at the moment until they find a way to respect women's rights more and to allow freedom of expression without, the brutal consequences that are happening right now. So that is one of the responses of the international community to what's happening in Iran. There are also several UN experts who have called for independent investigations into Iran's brutal response to the protests. You've probably heard of the morality police in Iran. There's been some news reports in the last couple of days that maybe Iran is going to change or get rid of the morality police. Not quite clear when or if that's going to happen, but they are largely responsible for the harm that has come to many of the protesters and the fact that over 400 people have died in these protests, in addition to the thousands more who have been injured. And so some of the Western countries, again, US, Canada, European Union countries, have imposed sanctions on Iran's leaders. And some of them have specifically identified some of the high-level leaders in the morality police and have imposed sanctions on them. So what does that mean? It means that they have frozen bank accounts and other assets. They've prohibited them from being able to travel outside the country. Those are the kinds of sanctions that the international community can impose. So again, not anything that is perhaps a strong and concrete response so far, other than some additional sanctions. But the United States already had sanctions on Iran because of concerns over its nuclear weapons program and other concerns about Iran. So we can increase those sanctions, but there's always a concern that if you cut off trade completely, if you impose blanket sanctions on a country, you end up hurting the people who are already the most vulnerable. You cut off supplies for food and other necessities that people need access to, while at the same time often not bringing about the political changes that you hope to bring about. And so we're seeing instead these more targeted sanctions that are really aimed at the leaders of the country and those who are most responsible for what's happening. All right. So in our world today, one of the biggest issues we're seeing is the increase in refugee flows. And we're seeing this in many, many different parts of the world. So, of course, the war in Ukraine has caused, hundreds of thousands of people to flee from Ukraine. But it didn't start or end in Ukraine by any means. And so in the lower left corner here, this is the island of Lampedusa in the Mediterranean, where you see the boat in the background and the persons who were picked up in the Mediterranean Sea sitting on the ground. Most of these people are from Syria and also from some Northern African countries and Middle Eastern countries who are attempting to flee to Europe by boat, usually boats that are severely overcrowded, boats that do not have the necessary safety equipment. They get picked up. These rescue ships then, take them to a safe port, like in Greece or in Italy. But then the European Union doesn't want to house these refugees. And so, what do we do with them? And so these, are often the Syrians that are most impacted here. Then we have Uyghurs in China. This is a minority ethnic group in China that the Chinese have been persecuting quite strongly for some time. We have the Rohingya down here in the bottom right, fleeing from Myanmar, Burma, and who've also suffered incredibly at the hands of the government there. And then finally, in our own backyard, in the upper right, this is a camp at the US border fence, and it shows you primarily Haitians, Venezuelans, Colombians, people who are coming up from the south and reaching our US border, and then being told that they cannot enter, even if they are valid refugees fleeing persecution. The government has been using Title 42, which is a health measure, arguing that because of COVID, we can make people remain outside the country in dangerous conditions while they are waiting to be able to tell their story and potentially receive asylum in the United States. And so we're just seeing unprecedented numbers of refugees today, as compared to any time since World War II. We are at quite a high level, and it has grown exponentially over the last decade. This idea that people are fleeing their countries because of persecution and trying to find a safe haven in another country. So I think this is one of the biggest issues in international law, and it's going to continue to be one of the biggest issues in international law. The United States is a party to the UN Refugee Convention, as are the vast majority of states in the world. To be a refugee, you have to be someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution, that if you were to return to your country, you would face some kind of serious harm on account of your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. As I indicated, the numbers are just increasing every year. So currently there are about 32 million refugees worldwide. Half of them are children under the age of 18. And this information comes from the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. There are many, many more persons who are internally displaced within their home country. So think of Ukrainians who cannot be in Mariupol, for example, who have fled to the western part of the country to be farther from the Russian offenses. That would be someone who is internally displaced. So their home may be destroyed. They may be afraid or unable to go back to the region where their home was, but they haven't actually left their country. One of the weaknesses of the UN Refugee Convention is that while it defines who is a refugee and it sets forth some rights of refugees, it does not require any state in the international community to accept any particular number of refugees or to resettle refugees. Each state that belongs to the convention decides for itself how many refugees it wants to accept, and it can accept none. So while we see this incredible growth in the number of refugees around the world and this desperate need for safety, we do not have anything that requires any state to accept these refugees. There are, of course, international efforts going on to try to facilitate states accepting more refugees. There are regional agreements in the European Union. There are regional agreements between the United States and some of our partners and neighbors to the south about resettling refugees and addressing refugee flows. But there's still really a Band-Aid on a much, much bigger problem. And as an international community, we haven't figured this out. And one of the things that experts are predicting is that as climate change continues, as people lose access to clean water, arable land, and related necessities for life, we're going to see large movements of people from the south to the north seeking just the basic necessities. And so they're called climate change refugees, but they're not refugees in the traditional legal sense that they're fleeing persecution. Instead, they're more economic refugees, or, as the word suggests, climate change refugees, meaning they're being driven out because there's not food and water in the places that they were living. And we're beginning to see that, but as an international community, I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming years. And so we've got to do a better job of figuring out this problem. All right, so I chose some things that I thought might be of interest to the League of Women Voters to talk about, some of the things that we're hearing in the news quite a bit here in the United States. But there are so many other challenges in the world that we could talk about. I mentioned the climate change refugees, but climate change in general, of course, is going to be a challenge for all of us going forward. How do we adjust to the changes in our weather patterns? We are just coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, but there are always new viruses, new mutations, new health concerns that the international community is going to have to face. Violence, both armed conflict and domestic violence, our gun, violence here in the United States continues at a terrible rate. And that is something all around the world that we have to face. Of course, hunger, poverty, discrimination, new kinds of weapons of mass destruction, many, many challenges for the international community. But I thought what I would do after listing all these wonderful issues for us to think about is to stop again and see if there are questions or other topics that you would like to discuss. So I do see a question about Biden's policy towards our southern border, and I think it is in a state of flux right now, very much so. We always see increases in the number of people seeking to cross the border when the weather's better. We will likely see some abatement in the numbers in the next few months as the cold weather sets in. That is an additional challenge for those who are trying to cross the southern border. Right now, the Biden administration has reinstated the Trump era policy under Title 42. That's one I mentioned earlier that says that we can force people to stay outside the country. Under the Trump administration, it was sometimes referred to as the Remain in Mexico policy, that people had to stay outside of the United States. Many of them ended up in these horrible camps along the border where there was a lot of crime and a lack of safety. The Mexican government was either unable or unwilling to cope with these camps. And so there's ongoing conversations between the government of the United States and the government of Mexico about how to handle these refugee flows. The latest large surge came from Venezuela because of the political situation in Venezuela. And it became so overwhelming that the Biden administration decided that they would only allow in less than 100,000. I don't remember the exact number. And that all the other Venezuelans would not be permitted to come here. And so they're going to have to find another country that might take them in. And the bulk of them are actually still in South America, just outside of Venezuela. But many of them made the trek, across Central America to the United States. And then, the Biden administration just said, we cannot handle this large number. We've got to limit the number that we can take and absorb and provide resources for. So from a refugee perspective, certainly the Biden administration has allowed many more to come to the United States than under the Trump administration. As I mentioned earlier, there were 76,000 Afghans who were evacuated in the last year and brought to the United States. There were also 100,000 Ukrainians. Some of those are still in process, but there is work to bring up to 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States. And then the Venezuelans were not as high as 100,000, but certainly several tens of thousands of Venezuelans are being allowed to claim asylum. That doesn't mean that they will all be successful in their claims, but they're being allowed to enter the United States and to live here while their claims are being processed. So we do have many more refugees coming. It's straining some refugee resettlement systems that had been shut down during the Trump administration and now have had to rebuild quite quickly in response to these international refugee flows. With respect to people from other countries, it's really up to Congress to change immigration policies, not the president. And Congress so far has not passed new laws relating to visas or quotas, the number of people who can come. They haven't acted on DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. None of that has gone through Congress yet. And so the Biden administration, I think, has only limited ability to affect some of those other immigration policies. So I see another question about immigration, whether there's movement in Congress on handling immigration, legal or illegal. I did see this morning in the news that there are 2 bills pending right now. One had to do with removing per country limits. And what that means is that we have different categories by which people can immigrate to the United States. There are family-related visas. So, for example, as a US citizen, if you wanted to sponsor your sibling from another country to come and live in the United States, you could file a family visa. Or if you're a US citizen and you marry somebody from another country and you want your spouse to come and live in the United States, you can sponsor them for a family visa. That's the largest category of visas that we have. But we also have quotas on how many people can come from each country. So if we have a ton of Americans, for example, who are marrying a ton of people from, let's say, Venezuela, there are only so many Venezuelans that are allowed to come each year. And if there are more than the quota allows, they have to wait till the next year. So one of the proposals I saw was that they were going to eliminate the per country quotas. I don't know how much traction that has, but it is something that I did see was pending. Another bill I saw that was pending had to do with easing citizenship requirements for non-citizens who served in the US military. You may know that our military does accept persons who are not US citizens to serve in the military. And there are special provisions already that allow those persons to have a faster path to US citizenship. But there are also things that can derail that. And so Congress is looking at potentially changing some of the rules that would make it easier for some of those folks to be rewarded for their service in the US military with US citizenship. I suspect that one probably has a better chance of passage, but I don't know how far along it is. So those are a couple, but in terms of the bigger pieces, even though there is bipartisan support to do something about DACA to allow the young folks who were brought here as children and who are now, young adults to be able to stay long-term in the United States, the Republicans have insisted that they would not support legislation in Congress that creates that pathway for the young people unless there is more done on border security. So there's going to have to be a negotiation on some of those other issues. And then there's a question about whether the press is confusing in the United States with respect to what's happening at our southern border and, whether they're failing to properly educate the population of the United States. Yes, I do think there's a lot of misinformation in the news. And I love the opportunity to speak to groups like this so that, I can answer questions and I can correct misinformation whenever possible. There's just so much rhetoric out there that is not necessarily grounded in facts that I think all of us have to, sort of put aside some of our preconceived notions or assumptions and really educate ourselves about what the facts are and grapple with some of these really difficult challenges. In my personal opinion and experience, we cannot accept all the refugees in the world. We don't have the resources to do that in a way that would help those people to be successful and, allow all of us to be successful. And yet, how do we convince the rest of the world to step up and share that responsibility with us? That's really our challenge going forward, I think, with respect to refugees in particular, but so many other areas where we have this shared responsibility to figure out a better way to do things. I think that's all the questions I have so far, and we're almost out of time. So maybe this is a good time to stop unless there's a final burning question. I'm going to stop my share.
Any more questions? Cindy, thank you very much for this informative hour. Appreciate it very much. And hopefully we can see resolutions to some of these issues.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'd
You're
like
very
to,
welcome.
oh, sorry. I'd like to remind the membership that Maureen Berkowitz will be speaking at our January meeting, which will be a Zoom meeting also through the library. So watch for a notification of that. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Appreciate it. Bye.